Good evening, and thank you for being here. Please join me as I explain the digital exhibit, A Century of Unheralded Warfare, and we focus on the history of the Buccaneers and their role in Puerto Rican history. Puerto Ricans have been serving the United States military since 1898 as volunteers and scouts, and in Puerto Rican units since 1899. Their service has been either ignored, lionizing heroic accounts, or the soldiers themselves villainized as vendepatrias, or condescendingly treated as pawns in a game they didn't understand, or a simple cannon fodder for the wars of the empire. All these approaches are wrong. They fail to understand how complex the history of military service has been in the development of the people we call the Puerto Ricans. This is why we have created this exhibit tracing the rich and unknown history. A century of unheralded service is how we have called this exhibit, and we'll explain why. The exhibit goes beyond numbers, places, battles, and war. That can be found in Google. The exhibit thematic digs into how military service has influenced the history of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Ricans. It covers from the last quarter century under Spain all the way to the present. It includes primary documents, records, letters, newspaper clips, videos, images, maps, and interviews with the veterans. It addresses reasons to serve, to join, or to stay, and from the GI Bill to PTSD and the creation of new diasporic centers across the United States led by a military migration. And the content and text accompanying this exhibit has been peer-reviewed and curated. There is much context and analysis involved in the production of this exhibit. The target audience goes from Puerto Ricans wanting to know more about their history and ancestry to high school and college students. And it is also a good departing point for college professors and the general audience to initiate their own research in this very rich history. I would like to take the opportunity to focus today on one of the topics covered in this exhibit. The past June 25, 2020, marked the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. No conflict has been as impactful and transformative for Puerto Rico and the Puerto Ricans as the Korean War. In slightly over 3 years of fighting, some 61,000 Puerto Ricans served in the United States Armed Forces, mostly in the Army, and they suffered over 3,500 casualties, of which over 700 were killed in action or died of their wounds. By comparison, during World War II, 65,000 Puerto Ricans served, of which 368 lost their lives in combat training and accidents. The number of Puerto Ricans serving in the biggest conflagration ever was about the same of the Korean War, where the fighting was limited to the Korean Peninsula. These numbers tell us much about the nature of Puerto Rican involvement in both wars. In a regional conflict, although global repercussion like the Korean War, the number of Puerto Rican fatal casualties was twice as much as in World War II. This is the case because the Korean War was the first instance in which large numbers of Puerto Ricans were sent into combat as first-line troops and as Puerto Rican units. This is the most relevant issue and part of what makes the Korean War so impactful in Puerto Rican history and society, both for the archipelago and Puerto Rican stateside communities. Moreover, unlike the Vietnam War, most of the Puerto Ricans who served in the Korean War did so as infantrymen and as part of the 65th United States Army Infantry Regiment. The history of this regiment is another element making the Korean War so different from other conflicts in Puerto Rican history. The 65th Infantry was known in Puerto Rico as El 65 and its men as the Buccaneers, a Spanish and English transliteration of Boriquen, the Arawak or Taino indigenous name for Puerto Rico. They fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953 as part of the United States Army 3rd Infantry Division. The 65th was a distinctively Puerto Rican outfit. The enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, and some junior officers in the 65th were Puerto Ricans, while most senior officers were continental Americans. The origins of this segregated unit are found in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898 with the creation of what came to be known as the First American Colonial Army. Intended for service on the island, regarded as unfit for combat and overseas deployment, and colloquially called a rum and coke outfit, the 65th was kept far from combat until the Korean War, when it was sent to fight as first-line troops for the first time. It is important to notice that the 65th was not a National Guard unit, but part of the regular United States Army. The fact that the 65th was a segregated regiment for Puerto Rican enlisted men and led mostly by non-Puerto Rican whites made its rank and file colonial troops, and the regiment the only Hispanic segregated unit in the United States military. Up to the Korean War, institutional racism had kept Puerto Rican units from the battlefield. Just like most African American units, they were simply not trusted in battle because of their race and culture, as many official documents from the War Department evidence. On October 12, 1950, Puerto Ricans learned that the 65th was fighting in Korea. The island's newspapers were full of stories and pictures of the soldiers and the ceremonies held previous to their departure. Island-wide, the people of Puerto Rico joined to support the 65th throughout the war. Governor Luis Muñoz Marin often made reference to the men of the 65th in his speeches. The crest of the regiment was painted in public buses and train cars. Plazas and avenues were named to honor the regiment. Returning soldiers, especially the wounded, were received as heroes and treated to public reception by government officials. Governor Muñoz Marin himself attended the burials of the fallen and sent his recorded speeches to the troops in Korea. In the early days of the war, a day did not pass in which the island press didn't write about the Puerto Rican soldiers. Soldiers were also paid to endorse local products, from non-alcoholic malt beverages to powdered milk. Some of the soldiers' exploits even found their way to comic strips in Puerto Rico. The 65th had become a national icon on the island and among the growing Puerto Rican communities in the mainland. The majority of the men of the 65th Infantry could have not been prouder to belong to a regiment with such strong ties to Puerto Rico. The island civilian population shared that same pride. What were the reasons for such sentiments? Most of the 65th enlisted men had entered the military to escape the island's economic problems. But once they joined the regiment, they remained in uniform for something else besides steady pay. Even after the Korean War had become a bloody stalemate and the Puerto Rican press began to publish long casualty lists, the recruiting stations in Puerto Rico never lacked for enthusiastic volunteers. The daily news in the local press detailing the heroic of the Burincaneers led to many men enlisting, hoping to be assigned to the 65th, the all Puerto Rican regiment. Many Puerto Ricans did not serve with the 65th, as it could not absorb the steady stream of volunteers from the island. Of the roughly 43,000 men who served with the 65th, over 39,000, or roughly 91%, were volunteers. The numbers of Puerto Ricans volunteering to fight in this war led to recruitment centers in Puerto Rico rarely having to use the draft. The press and Puerto Rican politicians shared much of the responsibility for the people's willingness to go to war. These opinion makers heralded the Burincaneers as heroes even before they reached Korea. The press, the politicians, elected officials, and the private sector praised, and I quote, "our boys fighting alongside the United Nations to defend world freedom and democracy," end of quote. And think about that, colonial subject defending world freedom and democracy. In addition, the press talked about the experience of the 65th as a possible catalyst for getting rid of, and I quote, "the old man and for forging a modern Puerto Rican nationality," end of quote. These same articles also praised the role of the Burincaneers in abolishing Puerto Rican's inferiority complex, and I quote, "the byproduct of hundreds of years of colonial-type regimes," end of quote. The Puerto Rican press, elected officials, and politicians saw in the Korean War an opportunity to prove that Puerto Ricans were politically mature and hence ready for self-determination. By doing so, political leaders and the news media place a heavy burden on the Puerto Rican people who came to see as their duty to either volunteer for military service or support the war effort. The local leadership, especially the Popular Democratic Party under Luis Muñoz Marin and the press, sold to the masses the ideals of heroism, democracy, freedom, and a modern Puerto Rico to secure a more autonomous governance for the island. And in many ways, it tied their political project to participation in the war. In a very real sense, the battle the Puerto Ricans fought in Korea was a battle for equality, and for many, one of decolonization. At least, that is how many of the men perceive it and how the political elites imagine it. Donning the uniform during the Korean War, in particular that of the United States Army, also had political and social value for emerging communities in the eastern seaboard of the United States. The actions of the 65th were included in the Acts and Annals of Congress and published in the national press. The Puerto Rican stateside local community and press also followed the war and the Borinqueneers. They kept an eye on the returning soldiers and in particular on the wounded and repatriated former prisoners of war as they completed a circuit that took them from Korea to Japan to the West Coast, often to Walter Reed Military Hospital in Maryland, New York, and for most, finally to Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rican community and press followed in detail the return of their heroes, and New York City officials gave the keys of the city to several of them while parades were organized to honor them. This happened at a time in which some elected officials sought answer to, and I quote, the Puerto Rican problem. This problem was nothing but the constant influx of Puerto Ricans to the eastern seaboard as Puerto Rico transitioned from an agrarian to an industrial-based economy and relied on the exodus of hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans to the mainland to alleviate unemployment. As Puerto Rican communities grew, they faced all kinds of discriminations. Highlighting the service and sacrifice of Puerto Ricans in the war was a form of politics or respectability and also a way of staking a claim of belonging for sprawling Puerto Rican stateside communities. The 65th status as a national icon and source of pride and belonging went beyond the archipelago. The call to arm, nevertheless, was ambiguous. The press and the governor of the island told Puerto Rican that it was their duty as Puerto Rican to defend the American nation, to which they belong. That was the message. The enthusiastic response to this call further complicated the essence of Puerto Ricanness. It was common for soldiers deployed in Korea to express they felt they were both Puerto Ricans and Americans. This is one of the central issues I explore in my forthcoming book, Fighting on Two Fronts, the experience of the Puerto Rican soldiers in the Korean War, soon to be published by Centro Press, because the narrative regarding the Puerto Ricans' identity became one of the ideological pillars for the creation of the Free Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Estado Libre Asociado, which was established on July 25, 1952, and which still defines the relation between the United States and the island.
Now we welcome Laura Oviedo to comment on this presentation. Thank you so much, Laura. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura, as Alejandra did note. And thank you for Harry's first segment of his webinar presentation. What I'm going to do in my segment is to kind of provide an overarching history of how Latino military service has been written about and explored in academia and in public history. I'll make some connections and intriguing points of Harry's webinar, and then I'll close out with how the digital journal exhibit by El Centro provides a groundbreaking but also very foundational work for future scholars or the public who wants to get to know more about this. And so I'm going to play a video as I'm talking with photos of celebrations that I've gone to in Puerto Rico to celebrate not only the Borinqueneers but all veterans. And so that will be playing as I am discussing. In Latino and Latina history, the veterans have been a large part of civil rights history, and most of their participation has been at the forefront of how these communities have fought for civil rights for their communities. I started off as a historian doing research in Chicano communities. I grew up with 3 brothers in the military, and with, I can't even count on all my toes and hands how many family members and friends I have in the military. And growing up along the US-Mexico border, for me, it always just surprised me how many Mexicans are joining the military despite all the immigration laws or the anti-Mexican sentiment that our communities felt. And so for me, it was always very confusing growing up, you know, with military JROTC programs in every high school, making presentations already in elementary. And so, you know, as I started to become, you know, a historian in training and really trying to learn about that, I started to expand kind of my questions to look at all Latino communities and really get at the point of how and why Latino communities have been serving the military when US history has shown us that we've been treated as second-class citizens. And with scholarship growing in Latino military history, the veterans have not only been put at the forefront of civil rights history, but like Harry noted in his presentation, part of the narrative of having these veterans serve the military has kind of been looked through a microscope of a love of country. And usually that country, well, the country is the US. But when you look at the different Latino communities, we have to really look at the uniqueness and of their history and the relationship to the US. So when I started looking into not just Chicano veterans, but looking at Puerto Rican veterans, for me, it was just very striking and very important to know the history, the colonial relationship that they've had with the US, and how the island and its people have continuously throughout history been serving in the military, trying to fight for rights. And it becomes more than just a love of country. It's more complicated, as Harry noted, and it's more about survival. You know, sometimes veterans serve the military because that's their only option to social mobility, to provide food on the table for their families, or to provide or to get an education afterwards. And so part of Harry's presentation and just the book that he did publish, Shoulders of the Nation, it gets at this complicatedness, the complexity of Puerto Rican military service, that I think it's very important for our communities and for everybody to note. And I think as we continue to learn more about it, the e-journal provides a superior foundation for that, because as someone who's done research all over Mexico City and Puerto Rico and the US, I haven't found an archive or a place where I can go and conduct all these, conduct research that specifically looks at Puerto Rico's long-standing relationship with military service. And one of the other questions, if you're looking at the screen with the video, is one of the major questions that I have and concerns, but also I think it leaves room for growth, and that the e-journal does is this photo that you're seeing right now is looking at the damas, right? The damas de Puerto Rico during World War II, looking at not only how war and military service impacts men, but how it also impacts women, right? You have Puerto Rican women serving during World War II. They have their own units, and they continue to serve post-World War II. And not just women in military service, but you have damas de Puerto Rico, like these on the screen, providing psychological, emotional, and physical labor to support family members that are in the military, both men and women. And I think it's very important for people to know this, which is why I think that this e-journal is very important for not just academics or people that are researching professionally, but for the public to understand that, you know, when people go off to fight in war, it becomes a community effort. And as Harry shows throughout his webinar, it becomes a community effort of politicians, of the press, of soldiers, and also families. And you see this photo. This is actually the photo of women in the Borinquenier Auxiliary. This was taken 2 years ago, and they still support the Borinqueniers Association that still survives today. And they go and attend monthly meetings, and they provide the support for their families or just friends that have served. And so, one, I want to leave this first segment letting you know that Puerto Ricans have been serving. I mean, obviously Puerto Ricans have been serving, but also the e-journal, how it provides different aspects of Puerto Rican military history that is not available elsewhere. And it leaves open questions, like that photo of the Dama showed, for future researchers to come in and try to expand on that and build on that for other people to get to know. And so now I'm going to open it up to any questions. If anybody has any questions on what I've said, of what Harry has presented in his webinar, please go ahead and add questions to the chat, and me and Harry will be more than glad to answer any of them, since we don't have a lot of time to discuss everything that we know.
I think we had
Okay.
a few questions that I've been answering while they watch what we have produced. One of them is the perennial question of whether citizenship was extended to the Puerto Ricans so they could be drafted, and that to this day that shouldn't even be a question. I mean, when the draft for World War I was passed, it called for American nationals to be subjected to the draft, and Puerto Rican were American nationals since 1900 because of the Foraker Act. On top of that, the original draft law excluded Puerto Ricans from military service because of the simple reason that Puerto Ricans were not wanted in the military. They were considered to be culturally and racially inferior, right? And it was the Puerto Rican legislature who demanded that Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans were included as part of the war effort. As a matter of fact, there's an article that is included in this in the digital exhibit that it has the documents and the reference showing all this. And if one of the hosts could please put it in the message board so the audience could access it, that would be great. But that's a question, and I don't blame you to believe it. I grew up in Puerto Rico with that belief. It was part of my DNA, and part of what made me want to be a military historian was to prove that. And when I saw the records, and it was the whole opposite, Puerto Ricans were actually not wanted in the military in mass and in Puerto Rican units. The 65th was a huge exception, right? And even though they were the elite of the Puerto Ricans and they were highly trained, they only went to Panama. And in World War II, they were not even meant to be in combat because they were not trusted as combat troops, even as well trained as they were, because of what the army, because the army and mainstream American considered them to be racially and culturally inferior.
Okay, Harry, and I think we have another question from Juan Perez. He asked, how were soldiers assigned to the 65th? Some family members and friends of the family from the World War II Korea era were in other units. So how were they assigned to specifically the 65th?
Well, this is a great question because a lot of Puerto Ricans who joined who volunteered to serve during the Korean War, they hoped that they would be sent to the 65th, but the 65th was was at overcapacity. So a lot of the people who volunteer in Puerto Rico and train in Tortuguero in Puerto Rico, they receive all of their military training. They receive it in Puerto Rico. They were inducted and they train in Puerto Rico, hoping that they will be assigned to the 65th. But in the 65th, which was at overcapacity, right, could not receive them, they will be sent to other units. So they were assigned to Puerto Rico when the 65th needed them. And by the second part of the war, even some Puerto Ricans from New York, other parts of the mainland United States started to be assigned to the 65th, especially because as Puerto Rican veterans were rotated, a lot of Puerto Ricans coming from Puerto Rico were not fully bilingual like the previous soldiers. So they started to send Puerto Rican from New York and other parts of the United States to the 65th to fill that language gap. So that's what will get you in the second part of the war. You were in New York. What would get you in the 65th was that you spoke English and Spanish, and you could fill the language gap.
Okay. The other question that we have from Rosalind Cleary is, at this time, do we also see the transition of Puerto Rican women into the workplace, such as in factories, that is evident in the U.S.?
Yes, we do. We do, right? And perhaps we do it even in higher numbers because, as you mentioned, the WWII in World War II, right? There were only about 247, right? And in World War I, the Puerto Rican women who serve in the military is even lower. It's not as open and as wide as it was in the continental US, right? For men, there were more open spaces in the military, but when the men are out, right, then those spaces, someone had to fill those spaces. And on top of that, this is a period of time in which Puerto Rican males are being asked to migrate seasonally to the United States to work. So in Puerto Rico, you're going to see a lot of, you're going to see great percentages of women joining the labor force and actually being the backbone of the labor force.
Okay, and we have another question from Mary Lou Clemente. Is serving in the military for, quote, financial stability and better opportunities, end quote, still that way in Puerto Rico?
Well, yes, and I would say that it is similar to some of the poorer states in some of the poorer federated states, but in Puerto Rico, there's also it's different. I served in the military in Puerto Rico in the Army Reserve and in the National Guard of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And one of the things that I noticed in Puerto Rico is that, like in the other places, most of the people who serve in the military, they come from the working class, but they also use that service to get an education and go from working class to middle class. As a matter of fact, about 7% of Puerto Rican veterans have completed PhDs, which is about twice or almost twice the percentage of Puerto Rican civilian. And this is because in Puerto Rico, because of the economic situation and the relationship with the United States, right? And the economic realities, for too many people, for a great percentage of the population, the military is their only hope to get an education and a better chance in life. And this continues to be the case to this day.
Okay. We have a few questions about the scholarship on Puerto Rican military history and access to that. And I think that's a really great way to jump into the e-journal conversation, because I think part of the problem in doing research in Latino communities is trying to find archival documents, because, I mean, if you think about it, you know, historians that have done, you know, white American history for so long, they've left written diaries and like all this stuff. And you kind of see that less in Native American communities, or, I mean, there's different ways of leaving histories behind in different communities. But one of the difficulties that, you know, researchers have with these type of topics is the access to archival documents, but also even funding. You know, not all people have the money or the funding to go to Puerto Rico and go do archival research at the University of Puerto Rico, or in other centers that they have there for research. So as far as looking at what kind of research have you done to put together this e-journal for the exhibit that can help out others?
Well, this has been the research for what you see here started when I started my my master's degrees at Temple University back in 1999, and it has continued to this day. And when I was still part of Centro, many years after that, when I was still part of Centro, I saw that Centro was moving toward creating digital exhibits, and I knew that I had digitized a lot of this information, and in it, I was also kind of worried about the lot of misinformation out there, of the information that is there without a context. So so we came up with the idea of creating a digital exhibit, and it was basically digitizing the research done in the Muñoz Marin archives, the things that I recovered from the Museum of the National Guard in Puerto Rico, the pictures that veterans gave me, that they just, many times I had to say, no, I cannot take the original, I'll gladly make a copy. So a lot of the stuff that you're gonna see here come from the veterans that I interview. Actually, interviews is now a huge part of this. We want the veterans to tell the story, right? So, of course, we have the National Archives, right? That's a great point of departure. But there's also the veteran themselves. They have their own mini archives, and they're so willing to show you tell you their stories, and proudly show you, oh, here they're talking about me, and give you a news clip, right? So I digitize those things because that's history coming alive, and the person who was there telling you their history, right? Which is part of something bigger. As a matter of fact, these veterans and otherwise and their family is what make the history big, right? So the archives in Puerto Rico, the National Archives, will contact veterans and interview them. They have kept things that if you treat them with respect, they're gonna share them with you.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Sorry we didn't get to your questions. We'll get to them through the Q&A box, but we're going to jump over to Harry's second segment of his presentation, and then we will continue answering questions following that.
The Buccaneers knew they were in the spotlight and came to internalize their iconic status. On Christmas Eve of 1950, the men of the 65th, the last United Nations troops in Hunan, were finally evacuated from the besieged port after covering the last stage of the 1st Marine Division retreat from the famous Chosin Reservoir. Last year, an American graduate student in the Netherlands sent me an email in which she shared that her grandfather was one of those Marines who, when they reached American lines and safety, were met by men from Puerto Rico. She wrote that she is forever grateful. And so was her grandfather. As the 65th commanding officer, Colonel William W. Harris, boarded the last transport out of Hunan, someone handed him a copy of an article from the Pacific Stars and Stripes. The article quoted Corporal Ruiz of Puerto Rico saying, and I quote, "We're proud to be part of the United Nations forces, and we're proud of our country. We feel that too many people do not know anything about Puerto Rico. They think that we're all natives who climb trees. We're glad for the chance to fight the communists and also for the chance to put Puerto Rico on the map. It will be a great accomplishment if we can raise the prestige of our country in the eyes of the world." Puerto Rican soldiers were praised as heroes and champions of democracy abroad and at home. Things would change during the second half of the war, and the record of the Buccaneers would be temporarily stained. The replacement of combat hardened troops with poorly trained yet enthusiastic recruits who spoke little English, an acute dearth of bilingual NCOs, and new continental officers that did not speak Spanish, some who openly showed disdain for Puerto Rican soldiers and officers, led to tragic events during the Battle of Outpost Kelly and Jackson Heights in the autumn of 1952. The back-to-back debacles were followed by a series of mass court-martials in which 87 enlisted men and one Puerto Rican officer received sentences ranging from 6 months to 10 years imprisonment, total forfeiture of wages, and dishonorable discharges for charges going from willful disobedience of a superior officer to cowardice before the enemy. Such news were hard to swallow for the Puerto Rican public. An assembly of soldier parents, mostly mothers, drafted and sent a rather Spartan message to President Dwight Eisenhower. The message read, "Preferimos verlos muertos." The parents' resolution, published in the January 26, 1953 edition of the daily El Imparcial in Puerto Rico, stated, and I quote, "We prefer to receive the corpses of our sons killed heroically on the battlefield of Korea than to have them return stained with the stigma of cowardice." End of quote. The parents asked for their son to have the chance to prove their accusers wrong by returning to the battlefield. Many of the sentenced soldiers wrote similar letters, which were then published in the local press. In a rare display of national unity, Puerto Ricans from all walks of life and different political affiliation and ideologies found common ground and rallied in defense of the Buccaneers. They were joined by Continental officers who had served with the regiment. General J. Lawton Collins, who had visited the training camps in Puerto Rico and was very familiar with the 65th, told the House Armed Service Committee, and I quote, "The Puerto Ricans have proved that they're brave and can fight as well as any other soldier when properly trained and equipped." End of quote. Under pressure, the military agreed to conduct a review of the sentences. Few of the soldiers of the 65th had their sentences reduced. The review board found the verdicts and sentences to be correct in law and fact. Between June and July of 1953, however, the Secretary of the Army reviewed the cases and remitted the unexecuted portion of the sentences of all but 4 of the accused. The soldiers who had their sentences remitted were returned to duty. The Puerto Rican public was still reeling from the effect of mass trial when more bad news reached the island. On March 4, 1953, an Army spokesperson announced that the 65th would be integrated with Continental troops, and the excess Puerto Rican soldiers would be sent to other units. The 65th would cease to exist as a Puerto Rican unit. The vast majority of Puerto Rican soldiers serving with the 65th Infantry promptly condemned the Army's decision. Pedro Martir, a member of the 65th for 17 years, declared that he would rather lose his pension than continue to serve in an integrated 65th. Other soldiers objected to the integration on the basis of unit pride and the fear of being ridiculed by Continental troops because of cultural differences and their difficulty with the English language. Corporal Felix Rodriguez insisted, and I quote, "I think it's better to fight with my own people. We understand each other." Private First Class Antonio Martinez, a Buccaneer from New York, commented that racial prejudice could make life hard for Puerto Rican serving in other regiments. The regiment, however, was quickly integrated as planned. Eventually, the Buccaneers record would be restored. In 1954, the 65th Infantry returned to Puerto Rico and was reconstituted as an all Puerto Rican formation. The island had its regiment back, but not for long. The 65th was deactivated in 1956, but the unit story did not end there. Colonel Cesar Cordero, who had led the 65th during the battle for Outpost Kelly, and who had advanced to Brigadier General and was serving as Adjutant General of Puerto Rico's National Guard, led an active campaign that culminated with the reactivation and transfer of the 65th from the regular army to the Puerto Rico National Guard in 1959. And this is the first time and the only time this has happened in the history of the United States military, when a federal unit is transformed into a state unit. Unlike its participation during the war, this event received scant publicity, and soon El 65 and the Buccaneers and their epic ordeal during the Korean War faded into a distant and distorted memory. The Puerto Rican had rescued their beloved regiment, but its history had not been restored. The Buccaneers' record remains stained. The culmination of the recovery and restoration process is the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal. Obtaining the award comes from the efforts of many groups and organizations, and in particular the Buccaneers Congressional Gold Medal Alliance, an effort that was led from the diaspora. This medal has been awarded to other famous minority units, including the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, the Nisei Soldiers, and the Mount Fort Point Marines, and recently to the World War II Filipino Scouts. The Borinqueniers are the first unit from the Korean War to receive the medal. The ethnicity and race of former recipients is not coincident. All of them fought during times of crisis to defend a country that at the time treated them, at best, like second-class citizens. The medal recognizes the valor and sacrifices of units like the African American Marines and aviators whose bravery in combat at a time when lynching was common and racial segregation the norm disproved the myth of racial inferiority and unfitness for military service. It also recognizes the courage of Navajo Code Talkers, who at a time when their language was prohibited in school, used it for communications in the battlefield, saving countless American lives. Or it recognizes the pride of Japanese American soldiers who volunteered to join the army and requested combat duty while their families were kept in internment camps. The Borinqueniers made a similar contribution. The men of the 65th were willing to pay the ultimate price at a time when Puerto Ricans were openly labeled in the press, in academic circles, and by elected officials as a problem to be dealt with. The bill awarding the Congressional Gold Medal passed both houses of Congress unanimously. When President Barack Obama signed the bill on June 10, 2014, it recognized the honorable service of the 65th, which during the Korean War had to fight on two fronts. On both fronts, the Borinqueniers, the men of the 65th, conducted themselves with honor and dignity. Since the American Revolution, Congress has commissioned gold medal as its highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievements and contribution. Since George Washington received the first one in 1776, only 158 individuals and entities have been awarded the medal to date. Few combat units have earned this accolade. The 65th is the first unit to receive it for its service during the Korean War, and they join Roberto Clemente as the only Puerto Rican or Latinos recipient thus far. On April 13, 2021, we observed for the first time National Borinqueniers Day. For some, this may look like too little and too late, for most Borinqueniers have passed. Other critics will say it is too much. They did their duty. Move on. The generation of Puerto Ricans who participated in this conflict, dubbed the Forgotten War, is quickly shrinking. Let us make sure that their sacrifices and their ordeal and what they accomplished for Puerto Rico as they fought both the enemy and racism is never forgotten. Let us not forget the meaning of the monuments, roads, and plazas erected and named after them, or why Puerto Rico has so many barrios and sectors named Barrio or Sector Corea. And let us remember that they represent the hopes of a people willing to sacrifice their youth for a better future, to pay a tribute of blood in search of acceptance, respectability, equality, a path towards decolonization, and a democracy that has proven elusive to them. I hope you enjoyed the exhibit. Thank you.
In this next segment, which will be our last segment, at least for myself, I'm going to play a video, and I do want to warn you, it does have a video of Roseo, but this is part of my personal research. I've been going to Puerto Rico the last 5 years to do research on Latinas and Latinos or Puerto Ricans during World War II and the Borinqueniers. And so part of this entire video is going to be part of that personal research. You'll see photos of the Borinqueniers themselves and clips of Veterans Day celebration and Borinquenier specific celebrations in the island and the National Cemetery of Puerto Rico. And just to reiterate, the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded on June 10th of 2014, it has been a really obviously much needed recognition for Puerto Rican veterans specifically, and their work or their service and during the Korean War. And as Harry mentioned, they internalized their status as national icons, and that continues till today. this video that you're seeing, it's a little bit lengthy, but this was a Veterans Day celebration where the Borinqueneers were actually sat in the first 2 rows of the entire ceremony. And so it kind of shows their place still today as national icons. And in this specific video, Rosselló is repeating and articulating what politicians and the press were articulating during the Korean War, as Harry has mentioned. And he says, and pleads, he's like, if there isn't a platform of equality, how come there is not that equal treatment for the veterans from Puerto Rico than those of the United States? And then he continues to plead. He says, quote, to my friends in Congress, it is time to put up or shut up. Finalmente, la visión de Puerto Rico solamente es posible con el componente de los veteranos. Sabemos que los veteranos tienen destreza extraordinaria de disciplina y organización. And he continues on to say how Puerto Rican veterans are central and the ultimate ambassadors to what Puerto Rico has been trying to showcase is recognition, acceptability, respectability, and self-determination. And he goes on to finish off saying that Puerto Rican veterans are indispensable to the vision Puerto Rico has for its future. And so if you can see these clips, these are part of the Veterans Day celebration in Cataño of 2018. And I think this is important because, you know, obviously it's still very important to Puerto Rican history, but now this is also becoming important to really major public institutions in the United States, like the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, you know, who's starting to, or not starting, they have been fighting and pushing for initiatives to cover the Latino, to recover Latino histories and to showcase that Latino history, Puerto Rican history is American history, belongs to the National Museum. Organizations like the National Council for Public Historians, and so many different initiatives. If you really pay attention, or not pay attention, but like look into it, there's a large push to include these type of histories, and the Borinqueneers are at the forefront, not just for the island, but in public history institutions. And I think for the e-journal, you know, I think it's part of that. It's kind of not answering, but it represents what, you know, Puerto Rican veterans, but politicians, the press, and the community on if Puerto Rico has been trying to do, is to show like we've contributed to not just to our island or to the United States, but we have contributed to the world, you know, and the maps and the timelines that are provided in these journals are exactly what the public needs to see, and they have a visual representation, which I love. If you use the timeline or the maps, it kind of takes you all over, and it shows you, you know, Puerto Ricans have been leaving a global footprint throughout their military service, and that is showcased in this e-journal. And I think that this is a big effort, not just for Puerto Rico especially, but also for just the entire world that now has access to this digital archive that is provided to see the contributions that Puerto Ricans have done. And I just wanted to share, if you see these videos of the Borinqueneers at the National Cemetery. This was actually a very beautiful ceremony where Korean veterans flew in to celebrate the ceremony with the Borinqueneers side by side, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful ceremony to see them and thanking them. And part of this initiative has been going on for a few years, where Korea has been flying in the Borinqueneers to share their culture as a way to be thankful for what their part has been in the Korean War and how it's changed their lives. And I can see no other beautiful representation of, you know, the Korean veterans and the Puerto Rican veterans coming together to celebrate what Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans have done for their own nation.
Dile hola.
And this
Hola.
Hola a todos.
is Domingo and his
Aquí en Puerto Rico.
lovely
Buenos días. Aquí en Borinquiní, en Puerto Rico.
Borinquenier saying hi and bye to everybody. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will go ahead and jump into questions if anybody else has some that we can go ahead and answer. Okay, so we have a question from Jeff Burrows to Harry. Can you please, one, explain the creation of the category of, quote, white Puerto Rican? Good question. And two, discuss the military service of Albizu Campos and its effect on the Nationalist Party movement.
All right, definitely. Those are two great questions, but before we do that, I really want to thank you, Laura, for how you prepare for this event and the research that you have conducted yourself and your investment in these projects, because you're the new generation of emerging scholars, and the way you deal with all this issue, it really makes my day. And thanks a lot for being here and doing what you're doing for this project.
Thank you.
So for Jeff's question, yes. As we know, when the United States took over Puerto Rico, they had a segregated military and a segregated society, right? The military is just but like a microcosm, a reflection of civil society, right? There's a lot of room for experimentation. It's been called a social laboratory, right? But it's a reflection of civilian society, right? So when the 65th started in Puerto Rico, it was reserved for white Puerto Ricans, right? And in World War I, it was white Puerto Ricans. And most of the Puerto Ricans who served in World War II, particularly when it seems that the 65th was going to go overseas, right? There's this story among Borinqueniers. I haven't been able to corroborate it, but so many of them have told me the same thing, that they were asked, take your shirts off. Why did they have to take their shirts off? Because Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, they all, I mean, even if they're light skinned, they get the tan and they start to look the same. They wanted to see which one were the real white Puerto Ricans in the 65th. Because the 65th could have gone to the French, Dutch, or English Caribbean, right, to free those troops from garrison in the Caribbean so they could do the fighting. But the governments of these places, they say, we don't want black troops. The response from the Department of the Army was, well, the Puerto Ricans that we're going to send, they're not black. They're white and they speak English and they're educated. You have no idea the requirement that they put on Puerto Rican to serve in the military. First of all, they had to be or look white, right? Before it was open up for the masses. Second, they had to have twice as much education as the regular private or inductee in the mainland, right? And they had to be basically, actually that is what explains why so many Puerto Ricans who are serving as private are professionals. Serving as private, whereas in the US, just for being professional, they would be given a commission as officers to lead the troops. In Puerto Rico, you have professionals serving as private. And as a matter of fact, that continues to happen to this day. If you see a Puerto Rican in the National Reserve or National Guard who spent 12 years as an E4, like the last rank, the last pay grade before being a sergeant, it's because most of the National Guard and Army Reserve in Puerto Rico is composed of professional, as opposed to most of the active units, Army Reserve units, and National Guard units in the United States, right? So yes, for World War I in Puerto Rico, there's the Puerto Rican fight so they can be part of this military effort, the war to end all wars and whatnot. The military decided to create the Puerto Rican Division. The 65th is sent to Panama in World War I, right? That's as far as they go in World War I. The Puerto Rican Division, the 94th Division, right? Number after the 92nd and 93rd Colored Division from the United States, right? And there's no coincidence there in the numbering. They were added following the pressure of African American leaders and Puerto Rican leaders in Puerto Rico, right? So that Puerto Rican division was meant to have 3 white regiments and 1 black regiment, right? But Puerto Rican quickly ran out of white passing Puerto Ricans, so they decided to make it 2 black regiments and 2 white regiments. Pedro Albizu Campos ended up serving in the 375th, in the 375th Regiment of the 94th Division, right? It was supposed to be the 373, the 372, 373, 74, 70, forget my numbers, I'm sorry. But the 375th and the 376 were to be like the 2 regiments of the Puerto Rican division in World War I, and Albizu Campos served with the 375th, right? He was sent to a Puerto Rican color regiment, part of the Puerto Rican division, the Puerto Rican contingent to what it was known as the National Army, right? Some people have argued that this experience, that being told by the military that for all means and purposes he was black, changed his attitude toward the United States. That it kind of, some people never understood why created such animosity toward the United States. They say, oh, they mistreated him in the army. He wasn't mistreated in the sense of training. He was mistreated in the sense that instead of being assigned to a white unit, he was assigned to a segregated unit. So, and just like all the Puerto Ricans from that unit, the 94th Division, the war ended before the last regiment was ready for combat and deployment, so they never saw fighting. But on March 2 of 1999, the whole division came out, and March 2 is when Puerto Rico became citizen. About 10 to 12,000 trainees and trainers of the Puerto Rican division, they marched from their training grounds. It wasn't Tortuguero, that is World War II. It was, you gotta help me on this, Laura. It's De las Casas. They trained Camp De las Casas, the savior or champion of the indigenous people. That's how the training camp in World War I was named, right? So they marched displaying the color of the United Nations. And after that, we know the career that, the path that Pedro Albizu Campos followed. And yes, he was heavily influenced by his experience in the military. He actually volunteered a couple times while being in the United States, and he was told to, if you want to serve, just go to Puerto Rico and we'll see what we can do.
Okay. We have a question from Chicano historian whose work I've actually read, Steven Rosales. He has a question for you. What are some of the more prominent comparisons and contrasts that can be made with other Latino and Latino groups, in particular the Chicano and Chicana community?
Well, that's an interesting story. And the only thing that prepares me to answer this question is that when you do Puerto Rican studies, right, apparently it's not enough. So whenever you submit something about Puerto Rican, they ask you to contrast it with African-American, the Cuban experience, Chicanos, Indigenous, and I'm pretty sure that soon they're going to add Martian, compare it to Martian. So what I seen is that there's a famous book about World War I, To the Line of Fire, written by a Mexican-American historian. And his conclusion is that, actually his argument is really well developed, is that the Mexican-American community and the recent Mexican community that has migrated due to the Mexican Revolutionary War, right? They're tired of war. They don't want to be part of the war, but they also want to be accepted. So they, just as it happened in Puerto Rico and among the African-American leaders, right? They encourage their own to participate in the war to gain acceptance, right? Like politics or respectability. But in the case of Tejanos and Californians, a lot of them, they just say, I'm coming from a war, I'm not going to another. So they just pack and go back. Many pack and go back to Mexico. Only in World War I, that doesn't happen in World War II. And it really doesn't happen in Vietnam, right? Puerto Rico, at the moment, World War I, right? It's an island. You cannot go anywhere. Plus, there's unemployment, hunger, whatnot, and this war is really being sold as a war to end all wars. And this is something that I always tell researchers. Take the goggles of the Vietnam War off and see World War I for what it was, right? During World War I, there wasn't anything more manly and heroic than to serve, not just to serve in the military, but to die in war, right? To the point that all across Europe, when World War I started, right? Classrooms full of people, the students got up, left their books, and went to join the war, right? This is at this moment in at least in World War I, right? Fighting in the military and even dying in a war, even if it's not your country, even you're fighting for another country, is a universal male ritual of passage, right? And this is something that you also find in the Mexican American and Chicano literature, and it's also found, and really shockingly, in the African American literature about the war participation, when they were excluded and sent to labor units if admitted, right? So this is the contrast and comparison I made between African American indigenous participation, Chicanos and Puerto Ricans.
I will add, you know, past World War II, I think part of that comparison is also, or contrast, is language. I would say, at least for the units that I study in World War II, one of the main reasons why Puerto Ricans, well, there's two main points that I would make. One is language. And although a lot of the veterans, Mexican-American veterans that served during World War II were first generation, because they were born after the Mexican Revolution, and therefore they had parents that still spoke only Spanish, and then they were, you know, what we call on the frontera Spanglish. You know, one of the main reasons why Puerto Ricans were segregated was because of language, like Harry mentioned with the Borinqueneers, but also race. During World War II, you see them in segregated units, but even some of them being put into African-American units. And because of the racial malleability of different Latino groupings, depending on the racial makeup, I think you kind of see more of the Puerto Ricans being segregated and even being put into African-American units, whereas Mexican-Americans were in integrated units. We're also in integrated units. And one of the things Silvia Curbelo covers this in Maggie Rivera's book on Latinos in World War II is she looks at the color line during World War II and looking at how officials didn't want to, during World War II, they didn't even want to move Puerto Rican units. They were trying to figure out, how do we keep Puerto Rican units on the island, because we already have what they used to call the quote, the Negro problem. And they didn't want any more Black people coming to the main side United States. So that was one of the reasons why they started to build up and train them on the island, to build up the military installations on the island, was to keep Puerto Ricans from entering the United States, because they considered them inferior because of the racial status. And of course, with Mexican Americans, are mostly, you know, at the time in the US Southwest, you see some in the Midwest as more literature is coming out, all this stuff. But I think that would be 2 points of comparison that I think, as far as experiences, that goes into the military experiences of Chicanos and Puerto Ricans. Okay, and we will conclude with that. And now, thank you, Harry, so much for your presentation. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of this. I have admired your work, and, you know, you as a person. I think the first time we met was in Puerto Rico. through our good friend Aura.
Yes.
So it's very nice to keep in touch and to keep building on this work and building on your work, and even Steven Rosales, who's in the audience. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, El Centro. I think what you're doing is amazing, and it's going to make such a big difference. I hope everybody turns to this e-journal and gets as much information as they can. Tell your brothers, your sisters, your community, everybody, just to check it out. People are getting online to get through Facebook or Instagram. Take 10 minutes to go through the e-journal, get a little bit of Puerto Rican history. So thank you so much, and thank you for having us.